I just first of all say that I am very grateful to be invited here to meet you, to address you, and to give you some information about the Irish Defence Forces, about my country, because I think that there are some lessons you can learn from us. And when I say lessons, you can learn from what we have done right and learn from what we have done wrong. And this is an important thing, that our path to independence was a difficult one. And it was one done through war and revolution. But these days we are in very, very good terms with the British, and notwithstanding difficulties over the European Union, Brexit and them leaving, we have arrived at a situation where we get on very well with them. But it's not been easy. So we have a different history than you have with Spain, but there are certain things in common. First of all, my own background, just to mention it, I was trained in the Irish Military College, the United States Infantry School, and the French Army Infantry School. So I'm a graduate of 3 different armed forces careers. My UN service was in Cyprus, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq and Somalia and Israel. So I've had about 6 different missions with the UN. And I also served as military representative of Ireland in Brussels with the European Union and with the Western European Union. So, but I was an infantry officer for 40 years, and then my last 2 years I was made head of the military police, and then I retired. So, but essentially I'm still an infantryman at heart. Now, to start on this, first of all, I want to see if we got slide number 1. First of all, I must make a few points here. A nation's sovereignty extends over its landmass, its territorial seas, and its airspace. In this case, in the case of Ireland, its territorial seas are 10 times larger than its landmass, making its territorial area one of the largest in the European Union. In terms of combined land and sea territory, Ireland is more than twice the size of Germany. So we have to think strategically now, not just the land, but the sea. And for the future that's ahead, where we're talking about the wealth of the sea, exploitation of oil and gas, all of these are very significant. It just puts a different idea on it. Now, the geographic island of Ireland is divided in 2 parts politically, Ireland and Northern Ireland. Ireland, my country, has a population of 4.75 million people. It's an independent republic. Northern Ireland, 1.8 million, is a component nation of the United Kingdom. Okay, this is just a quick look through history, and considering the history of Catalonia, and in modern history we're talking from Diada from 1714 onwards. So I just started roughly around that period. In 1691 we had a major war in Ireland between followers of King James and followers of King William. It was known as the Jacobite and Williamite Wars. And the biggest land battle that ever occurred in Ireland happened in the Battle of the Boyne in 1691. Ireland and France were allied, and the British and the Dutch were allied on the opposing side. So in 1691, the war ended, the Irish and French forces were essentially defeated, but a treaty was negotiated, and the Irish army went into exile, about 20,000 soldiers at that stage, mostly into France, but some to Spain and some to Austria and to Russia. From after that then, in 1798, we fast forward, there were other events in between, but I just want to talk about the next point, because this was the first Republican rebellion, where before it was all the chieftains, and it was in the days of the kings that we were talking about. But in 1798, the rebellion again, France again came to our aid, and we nearly achieved independence, but it failed. 100,000 people died in that particular war, and it was a Republican rebellion. So this is really modern Irish rebellions. Then in 1801 there was an act of union between Great Britain and Ireland. And Ireland became part of the United Kingdom in 1801. That's not very long ago. It's my grandfather's grandfather's time when I look at it like that. I'm 75, so tickety back. Yeah, my grandfather's grandfather. So you see, I knew my grandfather, he knew his grandfather, so we're going back to around 1800, early times. The Act of Union was a particularly bad moment because at that time only 10% of the Irish people had the vote. You had to be a Protestant to vote. The 90% Roman Catholics were not allowed to vote until 1829. And of course, women were not allowed to vote. So it was very unrepresentative. Similar to what happened in Scotland about 100 years earlier, a small number of people were given nice land and titles and bought on board. So the Act of Union, the first rebellion happened within only 3 years later, was by Robert Emmet. It was a rebellion in Dublin. It was very unsuccessful and put down very quickly. But what is important is that Emmet did his proclamation of independence, and that was particularly important. And I just read out later, Emmet was, he was hanged for his troubles, and I see, have I got the particular quotation here? No, sorry, I'm not doing too goodly in myself here. But essentially, he asked that his epitaph is when you die and you have on your tombstone a short saying, yeah. The epitaph, he does not want his epitaph written until Ireland takes its place among the nations of the world. And this is, we are coming now to the Republican philosophy of a nation taking its place in the world. And this is important for what I would have to say later on. There was another rebellion, then there was famine. Now the famine is very important in 1847. The population of Ireland was 8.5 million. And 1 million approximately starved to death, and 1 million escaped from the country. But it started emigration, so the hemorrhaging of the Irish young people, particularly going to America. So the famine broke the national spirit. It also marked the end, really, of the Irish language as the dominant language in the country. 1848, even in that period, there was a rebellion of young Irelanders. It was not a big rebellion, but it was important because it was the start of Fenianism. And then you had the Fenian Rebellion in 1863, again all inspired by the French Revolution. And then you have a rebellion in 1916. And again, the leader in 1916, Patrick Pearse, he read the Proclamation of the Republic. And this thing is what I'm trying to say. This is where last year, when your own president read the Proclamation of the Republic, it is a very important historical happens. And you see, it is very often proclaimed before it exists. So this is not unusual. I'm trying to say that it is the way of things very often. In our case, it led to a war of independence, 2-year war with England. That ended in July 21, and then we had the setting up of the Irish Free State. But this was followed by a split in the Irish Army, split in two, and we had a 2-year civil war. And civil wars are the worst wars of all. Whatever way you look at it, it's very divisive, and it lasts for generations, the divisions. But we were a free state, and we had about 80% of the landmass. Northern Ireland is not really the whole north of Ireland, just the northeastern part of it. But the point is that we were free. It was a free state, and we managed to keep out of World War II. In fact, we called the period the emergency. The emergency began in 1939. In Ireland, it went on for a whole year afterwards. We kept our forces mobilised because we were a little bit nervous that the British might come back. So then when we were happy that things were okay, we had peace. In 1949, the Free State became a republic. It was a republic in all but name at that stage. Then it became a republic. In 1955, we joined the United Nations. In 1969, the conflict in Northern Ireland began, and it went on until 1998, almost 30 years. And I mention that because that's relevant, it's important as well. One other point then, and the date is wrong there, it should be 1972, Ireland joined the European Economic Community, now the European Union. This is very important for us. So that's just a little overview of history. And I want to move on more rapidly now into the next slide, would be slide number 3, the roles of the Irish Defence Forces. Can we get those up? Can we get it up a little bit? Yeah. Now, the first role is the primary role, is the defence of the state against armed aggression. That is how it is expressed. Military defence of the state against armed aggression. In wartime, all aspects of society are involved, not just the military, of course. This is the primary function of the Irish Defence Forces. The other task then is, the next one is peace support and humanitarian operations. And I will give you an overview of our current involvement. We are involved with the European Union and with, of course, the UN, with the European Union and the OSCE, the Organisation of Security and Cooperation in Europe, and humanitarian operations. The next area is aid to the civil power to support the police on internal security. The Irish police are an unarmed police force, broadly. Now, there are armed reaction groups now have been set up in different parts of the country, but the average policeman does not carry a weapon on duty. So there's a requirement for military backup for police operations. Maritime security and fishery protection are put together. Joint task force on drugs interdiction. This is important because of the approaches we have, that Ireland from the west and from the south, you have many shipments of drugs have tried to get through. So it's an important task that our Naval Service and our Air Corps have. Aid to the civil authority for major emergencies. Now, these emergencies can be as a result of natural emergencies, severe weather conditions. It can also be as a result of industrial action through strikes. But when a particular crisis is one where the people are threatened, the army will be used to provide emergency services. And this happens quite a lot. A small task, ministerial air transport service, that means flying ministers around who are afraid to fly military aircraft in case the voters think they're wasting public money. But it's there, and it's a task of the army. Ceremonial duties. Now, people would think ceremonial duties, but internationally you have an obligation. As a foreign country will be sending ambassadors, and their heads of state will be coming, and there's always a certain military ceremonial protocol required for that. And then there are state occasions and indeed local occasions where the military perform and carry out ceremonial duties. So it's an important role of the Defence Forces. Search and rescue and air ambulance services. The Defence Forces has a lot of interesting equipment which can help when there is, for instance, where people lost at sea, we have helicopters and so on. It's not the primary role, but it's there and it's used. This is a new one, support to industry, research and development and jobs initiative. It's only in the last few years, and I don't understand myself exactly what it's about, but I understand that there is a link between now the military and industry. We don't have an armaments industry, but we do have dual use. In other words, we have industry that are producing software, for instance, in the information technology area, which could have a military application as well as a civilian application. And so there is connections between that and research and development. and then fulfill any other tasks assigned by government. So that's an overview of the roles of the Defence Forces. Now we'll just look at the current strength of Defence Forces. It's very, very small now. I mean, at the height of the Second World War, we had about 50,000 regular soldiers and 200,000 reserves forces. Now it's just very small and light. It's professional, not conscripted. So the Army is organised in 2 brigades with specialist units, including the Army Ranger Wing. The equipment is quite light, MOAG Piranha armoured vehicles, which is the backbone of the Defence Forces. And we have the Panhard AML 90s and 60s, I don't know if you're familiar with these, armoured cars, Scorpion light tanks, 105mm light artillery, 120 heavy mortars, Javelin anti-tank missile, heavy machine guns, and the RBS-70 surface-to-air missiles. The strength of the Army is 7,300. The strength of the Air Corps is, the Air Corps is the next I just mentioned, is fixed-wing aircraft is mostly very light again. We have CASA maritime surveillance aircraft, which is Spanish-made, and they're therefore flying out over our territorial areas and for surveillance. We have the Pilatus PC-9, which is used as a trainer, and also it has a limited ground support capability. Not jet. There's only propeller-driven stuff. Very, very light. We had years ago, but they're taking a chance at the moment, but it will come back again. We have Cessna, which is just light aircraft, and we have aircraft then for police cooperation and Learjet. The Naval Service has 8 patrol vessels, and these patrol vessels are ocean-going because our main seas are in the Atlantic. This would be significant for Catalonia because your seagoing area would be the Mediterranean, so the requirements for the technical requirements would be far less on that. Recently, we decommissioned one of our ships, which was too old to go into the Atlantic, but it's perfectly okay from to work in the Mediterranean for another few years. So we gave it as a present to the Maltese. So they have at least started their navy with one Irish warship. The Naval Service is a strength of 1,144. The Air Corps I mentioned is just under 1,000. They're not big. We're small forces now we're talking about here. What I would say about the Naval Service is, when I talk about the overseas operations in a separate line. The strength of the Reserve Defence Forces is 2,096. It should be 4,000. It's under strength. So we have a situation of where we're going quite under strength. Total 2,200. When I joined the Army, it was 20,000 strong. So we've had a big decline, but these reserves are far more professional than they were in my time. They're better equipped, trained, educated, and so on. So they would be called up immediately to give immediate support. So we go to the next one, slide number 5, overseas service. How can I explain it this way? The single most important task that the people of Ireland appreciate our Defence Forces doing is peacekeeping and humanitarian work. It's not shall we say, a core activity, but peacekeeping can only be done, military peacekeeping can only be done by trained professional soldiers. And this the UN have learned over the last 60, 70 years. And we've got in on this very, very quickly. And so these figures are actually, strangely enough, next week they'll be out of date. If you see the first one there, UNIFIL in Lebanon, 379, that's actually been increased now to about 500, of which 440 will be a battalion, a mechanised battalion, which we will have in Lebanon from next week, the 11th, begins the 11th to the 18th. So our actual overall number of troops are almost 800 again. The Lebanon has been a long mission. We've been involved in that for 40 years now. And it's very, very important. We have 136 small infantry force, again an armoured one, on the Golan Heights between Israel and Syria. We have then 12 officer observers, which is in UNSO, Israel and Syria, but also Egypt and Jordan. MINURSA, a small mission in former Spanish Sahara, Western Sahara. We have 3 observers there. There's 4 in the Congo, and there's 1 in the Ivory Coast. Now, on EU missions, we have at the moment 6 in Bosnia-Herzegovina with EU force, and we have 18 in Mali. And the 18 in Mali are a training unit to train the Mali army to deal with terrorist attacks. And then we have Operation Sophia, which is 60 approximately. It would be 1 naval ship with military army medics on board. The total about 60 people. And we've been involved in rescuing the migrants crossing the Mediterranean. And the total figure of migrants rescued by Irish naval vessels is now over 17,000. So it's quite a mission, and it's ongoing. In NATO, we have 12 in KFOR in Kosovo, and miscellaneous staffs around the world in 18. So this gives you a flavour of the overseas side of it. Now, I'm actually going to stop at this stage because I'm going to see if there are questions. If we leave the questions to last, or what stage do you want?
As you wish.
Well, we take the questions then. Now, I'm just saying that if there are questions, it'd be more useful for me now to answer the questions rather than just to continue on that. I will give these notes to Paul to put on the website or to make available to anybody who is of interest afterwards, and also the flash stick. So at this stage, I will take questions in English, French, or Spanish, or if whatever.
I have one question.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I already know the answer, but I think it could be interesting. When talking about that, we always been asked at the first mission of the armed forces, which is military defense of the state against armed aggression. When we speak about that in Catalonia, the question that most people do is qui voleu que ens ataqui? Perquè nosaltres, qui ens ha d'atacar? Pues imagineu els irlandesos que viuen en una illa al mig de l'Atlàntic. The question they always ask is who is going to attack us? Who is going to attack the Irish, which live in an island in the...
Can I be heard at the back there? Am I on microphone? Can you hear me at the back? All right. Yeah, I have to explain one thing. When you're looking at this first mission that Danny has mentioned, the most important mission to defend your state, you say, we have no enemies. We will have no enemies when when Catalonia is independent sometime in the future. Your Spanish will be your best and closest friends, hopefully. What I'm saying is that what you have to look at is the full breadth of history. And you go back 100 years, and every single country around the Mediterranean has been at war. Not one. I can't think of any country that wasn't at war at one stage or another. And if you look the next 100 years, and taking from the last 100 years, you have to think like that. You have to think strategically and long term. So there is always that particular threat. The second thing too is that if you have a country that's weak militarily, that has no army, when a time of war and crisis, as unfortunately will happen again, every generation thinks it's such a stupid thing to go to war that will never happen in our time or never happen again. But it does happen. And you have to study it to see and to understand why it happens. It is like nature, it is something that we can expect, that will happen. So that there is the potential there. And if you are no armed forces, you will be occupied. You will lose your independence. That is the way. If you look at countries that were weak before, many examples I could give, they were overrun very quickly. And this then leads on to the question of whether you defend on your own or with other countries. And here you have this question of with NATO or without NATO. There are advantages and disadvantages of that. But if you opt, for instance, with NATO, then you have a much better chance of defending yourself, because on the other hand, you have to help a NATO country that is attacked if a situation like that does arise. So that is one of the reasons why I think that the first role is one we keep pushing away. And even in my own country, we're spending very little on defence at the moment. It's something that will be corrected, but it's just not getting there right at the moment. We have this, for instance, we should have jet fighters. We don't have them. Everybody should have them. All you need to have over an area like Catalonia or indeed the landmass of Ireland is a situation where you have at least 2 jet fighters that can take off at any time on a 24-hour basis. I see the Dutch and the Belgians now have worked it out to alternate, to provide that level of cover. We don't have that because we're a neutral country. On the other hand, it is fair to say that if a situation developed over Irish airspace that was a threat to the United Kingdom, you can be sure the Royal Air Force would be coming along, and they would be legally entitled to defend themselves. But it's by default of us not doing that. So this is one of the big setbacks that we have at the moment. But that's really on the first question. Any other questions?
Mm-hmm. I'm just curious about the process between we have seen on 1921, I think it was the Irish War for Independence. Then on 23 it was Civil War, so it's mostly an insurrectional army. And then we see that slowly it became until it's already in United Nations missions. So how this process needs to generate the know-how to have international standards between an army that is mostly insurrectional until...
Yes, this is very good. Actually, historians have always have made a lot of study of this. You're quite right. This essentially is what happened. We had a revolutionary army, but that revolutionary army contained many people who had fought in the First World War. So there were many trained soldiers already. In the First World War, over 200,000 Irish men and women enlisted in the British Armed Forces. 36,000, you can look at the figure, 36,000 from the Republic part that I'm from died in that war, including a granduncle of mine. And so you have, this expertise was there. So demobilisation happened in 1918. Then the War of Independence began in 1919, and many joined the Irish Republican Army, which was the army of the state, recognised by the first Parliament in January of 1919. And so there was a lot of military expertise there. Now, when the split happened, the National Army, which supported pro-treaty, when the Civil War happened, they dominated. And when the Civil War was over, they were 80,000 strong, very, very big. And their success in the end, they were able to conduct amphibious operations in the south of the country to win the war against the Republicans. Very, very quickly, it became a conventional army. A lot of people who had been Irishmen, who had been officers in the British Army, came back and were joined up, and it moved very, very fast. Around 1928, we sent a military mission to the United States, and we sent our best and brightest officers to come back, and they set up the military college. So our command and staff process and everything is American, not British. And we developed then from there, and it's very much similar to the American, which is based on the Prussian system of command and staff. So then we had World War II, and we had the same thing again. There were many Irish have emigrated and were members of other armies all over the world. They came back and they joined up and enlisted, because it was quite amazing. Irish who were in the American Army, the Australian Army, New Zealand Army even. So we had a pool of people. But the military college was up and running and training our own cadets from 1929, 1930 on. So this is how we became a conventional army. Now, before the first mission in 1958, the first mission with the UN, we joined the UN in 55. So we had a lead-in period where we knew that this was required. So plans were done as to how we would organise to send troops. And we sent officer observers in 58 to Lebanon. And then in 60, we had a big operation in the Congo, where we sent 2 battalions. At one stage, we had 1,300 soldiers in the Congo. We had over 40 soldiers killed in the Congo. And overall in our peacekeeping missions, we've had 86 fatalities. For a small army, these are significant numbers. But we became that way. We also sent officers on courses abroad. Apart from America, we had people in other courses, such as I went myself in the 70s to the States, and then in the 90s, I went to the 70s to France and back to France again in the 90s. So we had advantage from all of that. But the actual conversion from a revolutionary army to a conventional army happened very, very fast. It really was, I'd say by 1926, 1927, it was well on the way. And then when the military college was founded, certainly well into the 30s, it was very much conventional army.
But after this conversion, how was the relationship between the legal army and the Irish Republican Army?
Well, first of all, when we take the history of the Irish Republican Army, in 1916, when the rebellion began, there were 2 groups that rose up in rebellion. The volunteers, the Irish volunteers, and you had the Irish Citizens Army. Now, the Irish volunteers was actually quite a big force. And but there was, when 1914 happened, they were persuaded by the British that they would give Ireland freedom if the Irish volunteers joined the British Army and went and fought. As soon as they were deployed in France, the British then decided they couldn't go ahead with Home Rule because the Northern Irish wouldn't agree to it. And there was another force called the Ulster Volunteer Force setting up there. So you had the prospect of a civil war between Northern Ireland and the South, between the Ulster Volunteers and the Irish Volunteers. And interesting enough, the Germans gave us the weapons for both sides. So we had the weapons, and the German Mauser rifle was the basic rifle of our War of Independence. Now, what happened then, the split in 1921, when the independence came, the National Army, as it was, such the pro-treaty forces, the IRA at that stage was, the IRA up to that point was the old IRA. We called them that. They were our people that went out and fought for our independence. But there was a rump element of IRA that continued and refused to accept the treaty in 1921. But when the war ended in 23, Civil War, later on then, through the 20s and 30s, they kept their small cells going. And they then, during the Second World War, they were in contact with the Germans again, but they were never strong enough to overthrow. During the Second World War, they were all interned, rounded up and just put into our camps for the duration of the war. There were some operations that were conducted. But the other factor I should mention is the Irish Citizens Army. They merged with, when 1916 happened, the Citizens Army, which was the Labour Party, the military, the socialist wing, they joined up with the Republicans to form the IRA. And that is a part of another interesting part of the history. But later than the Sinn Féin party of nowadays, and then you had the IRA, the Provisional IRA, all of that in the north, they do not have status in the Republic. They are subversive organisations, and they were a threat to our democracy as well. So they had to be contained down through the years. Their political wing is registered in Sinn Féin, and it is very much becoming a mainstream party and getting a bit more support as well.
And how was it?
Sorry.
Regarding the international expeditionary forces, how does the Irish forces, being so small, being able to sustain themselves? Do you rely on external logistical partners or your own logistical assets in the UN mission?
First of all, the percentage of people is around about 8% or 10% that's abroad at any one time. You say about 8%. You'll have about 8% then who are getting ready to go abroad. and you have 8% that have come back. So you have 24%. And then you have people who are involved in training and supporting them. So it's a huge activity for the Defence Force, even if we only say that there's, at the moment, under 800 people abroad. So, in the case of the UN, we have learned the hard way. We kit out our own soldiers and send them out there. Promises of that they will do this, that and the other have not worked out in the past. We have certainly taken on, and once a mission is established for a number of years, the UN will take over and will provide a certain amount of common equipment for all the contingents. But we do not let an Irish battalion go abroad unless it has got every box of matches that it has. I mean, when the Chad mission, I just saw it there, a clip of it, happened about 10 years back. That was the biggest logistical challenge we had. And I was thrilled because I was working in logistics 10 years earlier, and I've had a vision that we could do this at some time, but at that stage we couldn't. So we did it by contract. We hired helicopters. There were some assets offered to us from different countries. Not that much. We really organised our own thing. But that particular battalion went to fight. It was going to be a peace enforcement mission. And but I know the battalion had 12 million rounds of ammunition. And that's pretty heavy going for a peacekeeping mission. It was fully armoured and we had everything, everything. And it was very successful. And they didn't have to fight because they were strong. And it was a collaboration with the French. The headquarters was actually, the operation headquarters was in Paris, commanded by an Irish general. But logistically, we have great experience now. And we help out a lot of other countries in getting them ready as well, giving them advice and help and training. We have a very good training school where people come from all over the world, the UN training school in Ireland to train. This battalion is going next week. In fact, we just mentioned Malta. For some reason, I can't remember, Malta was mentioned there. We train Maltese Army cadets now in Ireland. And they're commissioned as officers, and two of them are joining the Irish battalion going to Lebanon. So they're one of the earliest of the Maltese Army now getting involved in peacekeeping, and they will learn. So we help them, they will help others in time. But we do have collaborations with other armies, for sure. In the logistical area, I just can't think of one straight off, but the collaboration is mostly in training. Our special forces, for instance, train with the JGGN, the French counter-attack force, with the Grenzpolizei, the German equivalent, and the Dutch Royal Marines. And they're all very good, and our special forces are very, very good. I'm so sorry I can't show you this clip because it was of them in action. You had another question?
Well, my question is pretty basic. It's pretty basic. How would you start a military, an army here in Catalonia? I know it's a huge question, but it means a lot of things.
Well, the first thing, if you read this book,
that I didn't know it was.
Yeah, okay, it's there and it's in Catalan as well. First of all, the approach that I had and most of our colleagues here had was that if Catalan independence is achieved, it will be achieved in agreement with Spain. You're not going to go down the Irish way and start a revolutionary war. This is the time we're in it, the European Union. Countries like Spain have changed. Countries like Ireland have changed. We don't. It's an internal EU matter as well, but you're looking at a situation where there would be an agreement. And in that agreement, you would have heavy negotiations to negotiate what assets would be available. So the first thing then you say, well, what assets, in the sense that there are also then, in the case of, say, we'll take Spain for a start, that you can negotiate with them on bases. They want still to have access to bases here. But in return for that, they would provide certain basic line of equipment. There are deals, the Czechoslovak army, when it's split in two, is a very good example, how they managed to negotiate getting the equipment. Now the training is a different issue. It's difficult because I maintain, and some of my colleagues would not be too happy with me saying this, that you have to look to Catalans who have served in other armies, And the obvious other army is, of course, the Spanish Armed Forces. If they pledge their allegiance to a new state, that's the way we started out, notwithstanding the fact that we had a terrible war with the British. We drew a lot from those who had been formed. Once you commit, you give an oath to serve your own country after that. It is a different, it isn't as big an issue as people would think. There is, at the moment, the European Union is completely, is not a player at all in this question of the movement towards independence that's going on here. But if you do get to the point and there is an agreement with Spain on that, you'll have a lot of help. There's a lot of goodwill out towards Catalonia out there. And countries, I can't speak for my own country, but I do know that it will be all hands on deck, that you will get offers of place, particularly in English and French-speaking countries. You do need, it's important in your case, to have people who speak French as well. I know that everyone is playing English is terribly important now for young people to learn, but France is your neighbour as well, and there's historical connections, and it is of use to have people who have French speaking. There are other countries, the US and Canada as well. And what you're saying is that you get the expertise like that, but you start small. You could even use the Mossos d'Esquadra up to a point. I have argued in an article that I wrote for the El Nacional last year, I raised this particular point, that the Mossos d'Esquadra is a very good police force, by all accounts. Very well trained, professional, well equipped, motivated. But they're not an army. And you assign a military role to them, it gets complicated. But they're there, and you can start by using their bases, whatever. You can begin, and you begin small, a company, 120 soldiers in training, and so on. And you begin and you build up small. You need time. It will take a long time to build up to where you need to be. And during that particular period, if it all has to do then again, if you are members of NATO, you will have certain cover and protection there. But you have to be prepared to also have agreements with foreign countries. And foreign countries, I would include an agreement with Spain as well, and France, the obvious ones, and that you will get help there. It is a bit more difficult in the sense that the starting position will be very weak, but it's doable. It is achievable. You would have a viable army of some sort, small, maybe in about 5 years. Yeah, but you won't have, until you have your own military college and your own cadets, men and women, officer graduates coming out with your own ethos and commitment, then you have arrived. I think that if you set up military college, you can't do that. That's one of the steps that you have to be past so many other steps before you do that. But when you get that far, then after that you can keep going. You become much more self-sufficient in training and raising. And you need advisors, plenty of advisors. If it happens in the next 10 years, I'm 75, so I don't know how long it will be. But you know what I mean. There is a lot of, it's surprising the way it happens. And when there's goodwill there, yeah. Yeah, it can happen, yeah. But I'm saying is that you certainly need a lot of help and advice in the meantime. But you can hire in people to do that. I mean, in the 1920s and 30s, Ireland, for instance, we had a Czech army officer who came over and set up our school of physical training. We had a German officer who came and set up all our army bands. So all our army bands were our German army bands ever since. The same, it clothed the whole thing. It was very Germanic. And the Czech PT thing, which was done mostly to ballet music, which is a bit unusual for military to be doing ballet music, but that lasted right up until the 1940s. And so there were others who came and they set up their particular niche areas as well. Sorry, was there a question there?
Could you expand a little bit further about the civilian roles of your army? I mean, search and rescue,
Yeah.
sea scenarios, or firefighting, for example. Does your army participate in firefighting missions?
What we have is, first of all, we have the Army has its primary mission, but because it has its equipment, because of the disciplined force, and we will act under government orders, that it can be tasked to carry out a lot of tasks. Now, search and rescue was one obvious one. For many years, the Army Air Corps did that, and now we have set up and the Naval Service, but we have a Coast Guard, which is a civilian organisation, which does a good bit of that. They have their own helicopters and that, but the Army help them out when they haven't got enough. But you have, for instance, when there's a strike, and sometimes a strike that affects the very fabric of society. I know one strike I remember I was involved in was an oil distribution strike, and the Army took over the oil distribution of the state. We had a small amount of expertise. Fire strike in Dublin, the biggest city in the Republic. We had a fire strike there. I was involved in that as well too. We had a small element of people who were trained, ready, and they moved in to do that. Natural disasters, we have flood operations every year, and more of it with climate change. It's there as even for instance, a transport strike in Dublin, small resources, put 200 or 300 trucks out in some of the more sensitive areas. We've used troops for that. So they're there, and it's good to use them. And the Army is appreciated. The people, the government will not call in troops to deal with a strike situation until it's absolutely desperately necessary, and until everyone can see that it is necessary, and they're screaming for something to be done. And then they go in, and it's good public relations for the defence forces as well to be out doing that. But it's not a core activity, but it's there. And then there's a lot of hardware. For instance, you can have in the technical areas, the Army Ordnance Corps has great expertise in the area of, say, dealing with if you had ricin attacks, which the police wouldn't have yet. There's a lot of military expertise there because you're dealing with chemical warfare capability and radiological training as well. So all of these assets are there.
Bé, després de l'exposició del Coronel Lee, anirem a una part més conceptual del model professional. Aleshores, primera... Acotarem el marc temporal des de la Guerra Freda fins als nostres dies i l'àmbit d'anàlisi serà únicament Europa, tot i que ens podríem remuntar molt més enrere, fins a finals del segle XVIII, i podríem extendre-ho també al nord dels Estats Units i al Canadà, però per tal de ser sintètics ens centrarem en aquest espai. Podem entrar-hi més tard, si voleu. Aleshores, abans d'entrar en matèria, hauríem de tenir una mica de condicionants, els condicionants que ens han dut a que els exèrcits professionals siguin majoritaris a Europa actualment, i per això ens hem de situar, com deia, en els moments de la Guerra Freda. Quina situació teníem? Doncs als anys 60, les forces soviètiques estaven en posició de desbordar l'OTAN al teatre d'operacions central, principalment a Alemanya. En conseqüència, es necessitava mantenir unes forces permanents de gran dimensió i, en conseqüència, la majoria d'elles eren de conscripció, servei militar obligatori, i alhora també hi havia l'element de la dissuasió nuclear. Als anys 60 és quan la Unió Soviètica aconsegueix anar tancant l'escletxa entre les armes nuclears dels Estats Units, principalment del conjunt de l'OTAN. Per tant, s'estableix aquest punt d'estancament. Hi ha altres factors. Següent... 4. Següent punt. Alhora també hi ha uns canvis socials i culturals. D'una banda, quan s'acaba la Segona Guerra Mundial, arriba el Pla Marshall, el Pla nord-americà d'ajuda a Europa, a Europa Occidental, i alhora comença a haver un creixent estat del benestar. No repeteix les circumstàncies que s'havien viscut amb la postguerra de la Primera Guerra Mundial, ni amb la crisi després del crac del 29. Alhora també hi ha el famós baby boom, amb el qual hi ha un progressiu excedent de reclutes, i també hi ha això, un relaxament de certes convencions socials i una desvinculació progressiva de la ciutadania vers els seus estats. Hem de tenir aquests factors en ment perquè tot això influirà a l'hora de l'evolució cap al model professional. Aleshores, següent. Molt bé. Quins problemes ens trobem, aquests canvis? Doncs, d'una banda, amb el tema de l'accés de reclutes, de candidats, diversos països comencen a establir el sistema de sorteig, amb la qual cosa hi ha uns que en queden fora. Aquí era en el cas dels excedents que deien quan el servei militar a l'estat espanyol. Què passa? Que generarà un cert malestar entre els que després havien de servir. Si m'hi toca anar-hi, per què l'altre no? Encara que fos per atzar. Seguidament, també hi ha el canvi cultural. És evident que els que van néixer després de la Primera Guerra Mundial i van anar creixent amb l'estat del benestar no tenien la mateixa visió del món que els seus pares. Tota la gent que havia viscut les dues guerres mundials, havia viscut la crisi dels anys 30, diguem que les expectatives eren bastant menors que algú que hagués nascut sota els plans Marshall i l'estat del benestar. Amb la qual hi ha una progressiva desmitificació de l'Estat i creixement de l'individualisme. No ho comento com un factor pejoratiu, però senzillament això és allà, amb la qual també això, mica en mica, va minant el concepte de servei militar com a servei, com a punt honorable i de participació ciutadana. Següent. Molt bé. Alhora, sí, també tenim el fet de que els creixents moviments pacifistes advoquen també pel tema de la prestació social substitutòria, el servei civil, tot i que no és un element exempt de polèmica, perquè el cas del servei civil es percebia com una competència deslleial per part de treballadors i sindicats. En tot això també el que dèiem abans de la dissuasió nuclear. Als anys 60 s'arriba a una certa paritat entre l'armament nuclear de tots els bàndols, amb la qual el front de l'Europa central queda estancat i la gent es comença a preguntar, bé, i aleshores per què els tenim, aquests exèrcits permanents massius? Tanmateix, hi ha una situació de bloqueig. Següent. Un altre punt, la progressió tecnològica, l'evolució dels materials, ja siguin de vehicles, avions, naus, no és la mateixa tecnologia, la dels anys 40-50, que la que serà als anys 70 i 80 amb tota la revolució de l'electrònica. En conseqüència, encarregar certes tasques complexes a un recluta té el seu risc. Alhora, amb això va aparellada tot un seguit de sorgiment d'especialitats. Aquest exemple, en el cas del Bundeswehr, si el 1939, en aquest cas la Wehrmacht, en una divisió hi havia amb prou feines 40 especialitats, i arribant als 80 hi eren prop de 900. Això era bastanta càrrega de responsabilitat i d'educació per una força estrictament de recluta. I són coses que van sumant. Tanmateix, el factor de la dissuasió segueix passant. Següent. Aleshores, les forces del Pacte de Varsòvia segueixen superant en nombre les de l'OTAN per raó de 1-3 de mitjana i, òbviament, rebaixar les pròpies forces en una situació així es considera com impensable. A la següent diapositiva ho veurem una mica més clar. Per exemple, si només que us fixeu en la tercera columna, això és més o menys l'any 84, la relació de forces de cada bàndol. Per exemple, només amb tancs, la URSS superava clarament les forces de l'OTAN, per tant, i això és un promig general. Encara que sigui 2-3, pot ser que en cas d'una ruptura del front a un punt molt concret, segurament als wargamers us deu sonar el full de gap, doncs l'escletxa de l'oll del full de gap podria arribar a ser, en lloc de 1-3, podria arribar a ser de 1-12. Per tant, tots aquests factors fan que les pressions a favor de reduir les forces permanents es mantinguin congelades. Tanmateix, arriba la caiguda de l'URSS i l'escenari canvia. L'any 89 cau el mur de Berlín, la Unió Soviètica finalitzarà 2 anys després i l'OTAN es queda sense l'enemic, sense la raó de ser. No obstant, el canvi de forces de conscripció, que aleshores eren majoritàries, a unes forces professionals, no es donarà de cop. De fet, les úniques forces plenament professionals que hi havia fins aleshores a Europa eren les irlandeses i les britàniques. En el cas de les forces irlandeses, com ja ho ha explicat el Coronel, i en el cas de les britàniques, de fet, el servei de conscripció havia estat molt puntual. Per exemple, només es va establir un servei militar obligatori al Regne Unit el segon any de la Primera Guerra Mundial i després, en començar la Segona Guerra Mundial, es va tornar a establir, però per tradició pròpia del Regne Unit no hi havia tradició d'exèrcit permanent, a diferència de les forces continentals. De fet, que tant Irlanda com el Regne Unit siguin països illencs, tampoc és casualitat en aquest aspecte. Aleshores, no obstant, pesa aquest dubte sobre què fer, en quin paradigma estem i com ho canviem. Següent. A veure... Molt bé. Tanmateix, en veure que la URSS ja no hi era i la despesa en defensa era quelcom important, ara, avui en dia, hi ha el debat aquest de què fem dins dels països de l'OTAN, si s'ha d'arribar al 2%. Pensem que tranquil·lament hi havia països que passaven del 3% del PIB en defensa. I tots els governs volien agafar i alliberar recursos de les forces de defensa i per invertir-los en polítiques socials o el que calgués. Aleshores, això també tenia la seva contrapartida, treure, evidentment, passar d'un exèrcit de recluta, encara que se'ls hi pagués poc, passar unes forces molt més reduïdes a unes de professionals, hi havia el problema que s'havia de competir amb el mercat laboral i, per tant, s'havien de pagar salaris més grans. Aquest és un problema que segueix fins als nostres dies. En podem parlar més tard, si voleu. Següent. Molt bé. Un punt que apareix immediatament, de fet encara no havia ni desaparegut l'URSS, però que ja es va perfilant, és l'aspecte de les operacions expedicionàries. Per exemple, si agafem com a cas d'estudi, encara que surti una mica de la mitjana, la Primera Guerra del Golf, allò no s'hagués pogut conduir amb forces de recluta. Encara que hi havia la majoria d'exèrcits europeus seguien sent forces en model de conscripció, a la Guerra del Golf es va conduir principalment amb forces professionals. El mateix cas va ser per les operacions, les successives operacions dels Balcans. Aquí hi havia l'element també, a banda de l'entrenament, de la por dels respectius governs d'utilitzar forces de conscripció, de servei militar obligatori, en un teatre d'operacions que no fos el propi. És a dir, que no hi hagués una percepció d'amenaça real o de què ja estem fent a tal lloc. Per tant, en aquest aspecte era més àgil utilitzar forces professionals. Següent Exacte. Segurament aquest gràfic l'haureu vist amb els diferents documents que us hem passat. Tal com us dèiem, la progressió és lenta, tot i que els primers països en adoptar el model professional són Bèlgica i els Països Baixos. La resta de països tardaran ben bé fins a la meitat dels 2000. Les dates que veieu, tanmateix, són el moment en què les últimes forces de reclutament obligatori surten de l'ordre de batalla de les diferents forces de defensa europees. Prèviament ja s'havien promulgat les lleis i els reglaments, però tanmateix aquí teniu les dades, tot i que al final podeu veure com a Ucraïna i Lituània es restableix. Però en tot cas la tendència és anar, durant els anys 2000, anar professionalitzant les forces de defensa dels respectius països. Què més? Això també ens suggereix un seguit de punts. Per exemple, hi ha el dubte sobre això pot conduir a polítiques exteriors més agressives? Des del moment en què el personal de les forces de defensa passa a ser estrictament professional, els governs ja no han de patir tant pel com reaccionarà l'electorat. No vol dir que hagi de ser necessàriament així, però és un factor de dubte que sempre, per exemple, en el cas d'Irlanda hi ha el triple lock, de que les forces de defensa d'Irlanda, Parliament, Government and United Nations, el triple lock, les forces de defensa d'Irlanda tenen establert que només poden ser enviades si hi ha l'aprovació del Parlament, del Govern i de les Nacions Unides. També té contrapartides, però hi ha aquest punt de control. Tanmateix, la resta de països europeus no és ben bé així. Sí que és cert que ens dona, en canvi, un punt d'agilitat. Aquesta foto no és per casualitat, és la de les forces franceses a l'operació Barkhane, a tota la zona del Sahel. Si heu anat seguint una mica el conflicte amb els jihadistes a tota la zona saheliana, a finals del 2012, una coalició tuaregs en la qual s'havien infiltrat forces d'Al-Qaeda del Magreb Islàmic i altres elements, està avançant ràpidament cap al centre del sud de Mali i les Nacions Unides aprova el 20 de desembre del 2012 una resolució per tal d'intervenir. Amb prou feines, en menys d'un mes, les forces franceses que ja tenien elements preposicionats en aquella zona intervenen. Més enllà de la casuística operacional, el fet de que en menys d'un mes es poguessin conduir operacions en aquella zona ve també en bona mesura que fossin forces professionals. Ho dic purament a tall d'exemple. Següent punt. Un altre punt de dubte, potser és una mica cridaner, és això de la possible motivació mercenària, entre cometes, de les forces professionals. Com he dit al principi, aquestes forces han de competir amb el mercat laboral i alhora hi ha l'element de que no s'hi va amb la mateixa vocació a defensar una amenaça quan es percep com una amenaça existencial al teu propi país, com, malgrat que qui més qui menys sap que la seguretat dels propis països també es pugui lliurar a les muntanyes de l'Afganistan o als deserts de l'Àfrica, això costa més explicar. I, en conseqüència, la motivació pot ser variable. L'element, evidentment, econòmic hi juga. Tanmateix, no estic dient que el fet que tots els militars professionals hi siguin allà pels diners. Ningú va a jugar-se la vida perquè sí, només per un sou a final de mes, o alguna excepció. Aleshores, també hi ha un altre element, que és el de la reincorporació a la vida civil. No és un element menor. En els períodes encara ara amb els exèrcits de conscripció o de milícia, el període de servei era relativament curt. En conseqüència, no hi havia gaire desconnexió entre el que és l'àmbit laboral educatiu durant la franja de servei. Per tant, no calia patir gaire sobre què vindria després, fossin 2, 3 anys de servei o menys. Tanmateix, quan s'adopta un model professional, els serveis tranquil·lament poden ser un mínim de 5 anys. En un món com l'actual, en què el mercat laboral és tan canviant, aquest punt de desconnexió pot ser un punt contraproduent. A banda no entrarem ara en elements intangibles com pot ser l'esperit de grup que genera dins de les forces i que després molta gent es troba, que ha servit durant molts anys, li costa readaptar-se al món civil. Però bé, aquí entraríem en un tema que donaria per un altre seminari. Com deia, no és per casualitat que bona part de les campanyes de reclutament de forces professionals impliquin l'àmbit de l'educació, ja sigui una formació professional o una formació universitària. Això no és per casualitat. Si us mireu les webs de la majoria de forces professionals europees, hi trobareu l'element d'especialitats professionals. No és perquè sí, això. Després, un altre element, següent diapositiva, és i això fins a cert punt inevitable, és el distanciament entre les forces de defensa i les societats a les quals pertanyen. En el moment en què les forces de defensa eren estrictament de conscripció, qui més qui menys, tothom, en aquest cas la majoria d'homes, passaven per les forces armades i tenien un cert coneixement de com funcionava. Tanmateix, a mesura que es van tornant forces professionals i que va passant el temps, cada cop hi ha menys gent que ha tingut una experiència pròpia en el món militar. Positiva o negativa, però que hagi tingut aquesta experiència. Per tant, si a més hi sumem que en aquest moment a l'Europa occidental no hi ha una percepció d'amenaces existencials, com podria ser a l'inversa en el cas de Finlàndia, molta gent es pregunti o ni tan sols hi pensin per què serveixen les forces de defensa. Alhora, des del personal militar hi ha també l'element de no ser reconeguts per les pròpies societats. I aquest distanciament és un fet que es troba a la majoria de governs de l'Europa occidental, fins i tot en el punt en què molts representants polítics que ja no han tingut una experiència militar, moltes vegades es troben en què professionals, servidors públics dels seus propis països, no saben ben bé com encarregar-los o no parlen el mateix idioma, per dir-ho així. I és un problema de la majoria del món occidental actualment. Si a més, i aquest punt us resultarà més familiar, i afegim que hi ha països del vell continent que no són del tot democràcies homologables, doncs és obvi que el distanciament entre forces armades i societat civil pugui ser encara més gran. Aleshores, intentaré no allargar-me perquè anem justos, no, de temps?
No.
No, anem bé. Amb tot plegat, podem arribar a la conclusió que el model professional, si bé era pràcticament inevitable i certament ha tingut prous beneficis en l'escenari postguerra freda, tanmateix planteja certs dubtes i queda a nivell operatiu, per exemple, provar com funcionaria en un conflicte de gran escala real. Pensem que fins ara conflictes com els que s'han viscut posteriors a l'enfonsament de l'URSS, fins i tot el més gran de tots, que és la Primera Guerra del Golf, han estat contra adversaris no iguals, no homologables. Forces, missions de manteniment de la pau o missions com la de Mali no és l'equivalent a combatre, com per exemple s'està combatent ara, encara que no surti, a l'oest d'Ucraïna. No surt gaire, però per exemple a Ucraïna hi ha dies en què el consum de munició d'artilleria són 300 projectils per tub. a la guerra del Yom Kippur, el 1973, el consum d'artilleria era d'uns 250 al dia. Això està passant ara, Per tant, planteja aquests dubtes. Com funcionaria una força professional reduïda en un conflicte d'alta intensitat contra un igual. Són dubtes que segueixen aquí i, en qualsevol cas, esperem que no s'hagin de resoldre by the hard way, empíricament. De moment, jo crec que ho frenaria aquí, a partir d'aquí, vosaltres mateixos.
Sí, de fet, la nostra idea era deixar força espai al final per poder generar preguntes i fins i tot debat, així que us animem a que plantegeu les vostres dubtes, preguntes o fins i tot reflexions.
Hi ha un tema que ell ha parlat el Coronel, de, per exemple, les forces de defensa i una part que eren voluntaris. Em sembla que ell ha parlat que a Irlanda eren només 2.000, em sembla, o per ahí, que havia baixat molt el nombre de...
De reservistes.
Els
reservistes.
Si en un país com Irlanda, que té certa tradició professional, passa, aquí es podria comptar amb una força de reservistes, com ho veieu?
Ara, a veure, estem filant molt prim. Sí. A veure, aquí hauríem d'entrar en el model que optéssim. En el cas de... sortia el llibre del cas del model professional, parlàvem d'aproximadament un 30% en cas d'optar per aquest model. Tanmateix, a veure, això són situacions en què es troben tots els països. Hi ha puntes i baixades a l'hora de llistar-se reservistes. També hi ha un altre factor, que és com el món de l'empresa respon a això. Per exemple, qui contractarà algú que sap que durant un període de l'any haurà de fer tindrà un temps de servei? És molt diferent, però, per exemple, en el cas de Finlàndia estan protegits per llei. Em sembla que...
The question. I'll answer your question because it's an interesting one. In the old days, the concept of reserves was to have a lot of people quickly into uniform to fight wars. Wars took time to build up. They didn't happen, they were months or years before they actually happened. Nowadays, it's very different. There's much more professionalism required of reserves. And there is also a requirement to respond very rapidly, within days even. In some cases, crisis will happen and troops have to be sent to it. So the modern concept of reserves are not the mass numbers of the past, but a small number of professionals, specialists mainly, who would be able quickly to join the regular forces and go out and do things. That's the first part of the question you have to say. Now, when you talk about Catalonia, the society, and how many people would be prepared, this is a different way. I put it to you this way. You will have, in a society, you'll have a proportion of people who are prepared to join the army, Air Navy or Air Force, in other words, join the military. It's not a calling for most people. The majority of people do not want to do that. They want to live in peace, raise their families and so on. But it's not like, for instance, undertakers. Undertakers are people who bury the dead. It's not a job everyone would like to do, but it's a job that has to be done. So in the case of the military, if it's understood their place in society should be a very special place, it should be understood that they have to be patriotic people. The ethos that they have, their outlook on things. You don't want people to join the army. You don't want people to join the army to make money. So you don't make the army like some South American republics where they pay them astronomical amounts. And I met people like that. So they know they have to be. It's a calling, and you will find that there is always a certain percentage of those who have a military interest and who have the national interest. And if the army is looked after well, now this is a problem. First of all, armies cannot strike. You cannot have industrial action. Police can in some cases, but not the army. There must be some element the government can depend on, and that could include reserves as well as serving people. There must be a certain amount that they know that you can. So that particular calling, you have to have incentives then for it. You have to make the life reasonably attractive as well. So it's a combination of things. I was hoping to show you this clip with the Army Ranger Wing, with the Specialist Force, because that actually gives you an idea of the motivation that's behind. It's all in Irish actually, but you don't need to know the language to appreciate what it's about. It's an incredibly high level of training that's required. But you will always find in society that you will have that number that will want to. Personally, I am against military conscription, and most of our crowd are against it. Who wants to have soldiers working for you who don't want to be there? You know? And in this day and age, you don't. People are more educated. You know, you don't want that. You want them voluntary to come in. So you must look after them. We have, for instance, in the Irish Army, representative associations, which are elected by the soldiers and by the officers, who can speak on dealing with pay and conditions. They can't deal with operational matters, but they can make the case. So they do, and they do help, and that does help to sort out a lot of things that do arise from time to time. But the place of the soldier in society, man or woman, this is something that has to. And I mentioned the women. The battalion that's going to Lebanon, the 440 guys, 21 of them are women, which is the highest number of women going on this is a combat mission, or potentially a combat mission. It's peacekeeping, but it's always potentially a combat mission. So we've built up the involvement to women very slowly, but the target figure is 15%, that we will go from about 7% where we are at the moment to 15% of women. And it's only this year that we had last year I should say, our first female colonel. I don't know why I'm talking about that now. But the place in society, I was going to talk about that, then I realised I was saying too much, so I didn't talk about it. But the reserve, yeah, I think that they've gone a step too far. The reserve should be around about 6,000. And because the reserve that we had before, the FCA we called it, it was a huge bonding. It was magnificent. It was the volunteer soldier. He got very little for it, but it was you were an employer and you were taking somebody on. It was, if he was in the reserve, that was a good man or woman to have, because they had taken on a certain amount of military discipline and skills and commitment and leadership.
Yes, but particularly in the view of our society, my question is how to combine for an employer. It could be a kind of liability to hire a reservist, because a certain number of days a year he must be out on training, and he could be called in a short notice and have to leave the workplace. And how you can combine this?
First of all, the biggest employer in the country is the state. So in the state system, the civil service, for instance, which is in our case would be the biggest single employer, would be the state. You can legislate for that. You can release them because you're in a section or department which might have, say, 600 people working in it, and 20 of them or 10 of them would be in the reserve. They can be let off to do their training and given extra time off for training. Not their annual leave, they still have their annual leave. So the state, first of all, provides that particular level. The other thing is employers, large employers do manage to juggle it. And then there's the private sector. There are a lot of people working in the private sector who can work and give their own time to the army. In fact, some of the best officers I know, reserve officers, they're in the private sector. They're in the big institutions like banks and that. They have also got the same thing. But the worst thing you can do, of course, is disrupt the young soldiers, reserve soldiers' education. You have a 17, 18-year-old ready to join the reserve. The choice that he or she has is to set aside university education, or how do you manage that? How do you do your university training and still do the reserve? So in that case, your expectation that they won't be available for training very much. And then if you call them up for longer periods, you have to give some kind of deferment from that. That is, that lesson was learned by the countries that had conscription, that you had this problem. In some cases, everyone had to do a year to the army, and then you were okay. But in other cases, people deferred to university education, and then it was too late. There's no easy solution to it, and it's up to every individual to look at his own situation. But we have managed over the years. Now I've been when I was a training officer with the reserve for about 4 years at one stage, I would ask certain employers to let people off for certain training, but I only asked the bigger employers. I wouldn't ask the smaller employers because they couldn't afford it. That's a reality. But then, there's no easy answer to it. But you certainly have picked it. That is definitely a problem. Yeah.
Si considera que el sector privado de
the PMCs. He's talking about the PMCs, the private military contractors, such as.
Oh, right. Okay. Oh, yeah. All right.
Ready to
I could tell you. I tell you a little story, which I will talk about private military side of it. There was an incident in Nairobi, a terrorist attack in Nairobi a few years ago in a shopping mall, and a large number of people were killed. But one of the security guys, private security guys, was Irish, and he was a serving member of the Army Ranger Wing. And one of the police that was killed, he picked up his weapon, his ammunition, and he shot several of the attackers and brought an end to the actual attack. But he didn't want his name mentioned because he was getting paid outside the state and not paying tax for his couple of weeks off. I'm not sure if the story is that he was still serving or not, but I know that he was afraid of the Irish taxman that it would emerge, because these guys get 500 euros a day or more, plus expenses for their services. Personally, I think that serving military people should never be seconded to these organisations. You can't, it's not right, it's wrong. You have no authority to go and shoot anybody. You're not in a military structured situation. So I have a certain scepticism on that. On the other hand, the Americans have used it in Iraq. They have these ex-military, which is fine. If they're ex, they're out. But who regulates them? What order? They've got to be controlled. Like even security people, I don't know what it is here in Barcelona, whether security people act under regulations. They must, or else they have they any right or authority at all when, to let off a firearm if they have a firearm. So there's a lot of legal issues involved, and the question of criminality even comes into play. So I would be a bit sceptical about it. But of course it does. And it is also true that military police, I was 2 years of military police, and there's a course that's done called a close protection course. It's like a bodyguard course, but it's a very, very high course, and it takes only a few people ever get to do it. And it was pointed out to me that each guy that got one of these courses could leave in the morning and get a very well-paid job with security firms. What can you do? I've no answer to it.
Un parell d'elements, de fet. Primer, que les companyies militars privades, els mercenaris, no deixen de tenir mai una vinculació a estats. Això sempre hi és, per més que sembli estrictament economia de mercat. I segon, algú que participa d'aquestes companyies, la motivació és econòmica. Per tant, el que vol és tornar a casa viu. No lluitarà com algú que lluita en alguna cosa que creu.
La meva pregunta anava més enfocada a formació, és a dir, a contractar-les com a instructors, com s'ha fet per part dels Estats Units en alguns casos.
Però és que aquí retornem al punt de partida. Això que deia, no estan dissociats d'estats. Quan a Puntland, a Somàlia, l'Eric Prince, va muntar una força, una mena de exèrcit privat, incloent-hi aviació, van anar a les Nacions Unides i van dir fins aquí. I, evidentment, depenia de la seva empresa, té base a diferents llocs, entre altres, als Estats Units, i no deixen de respondre davant de països.
És a dir, Blackwater o els seus successius successors, o qualsevol empresa d'aquestes, el cas d'una americana no actua sense el vistiplau del Departament d'Estat dels Estats Units, perquè en cas que ho fessin, a l'hora de tornar a casa podrien tenir un problema més gros, i de la mateixa manera, o sigui, al final funcionen com a proxys dels estats, tant els americans com els russos com els xinesos. Llavors, en el sentit de formar un exèrcit, són tan bons o tan dolents com l'exèrcit matriu del que surten. Entenc que anava per aquí, no, la pregunta?
Una pregunta, Rob. Quina creus que és la tendència actual? És a dir, professionalització o anem més al voluntariat?
A on?
Als exèrcits.
No, però en quin àmbit, quin marc estratègic? És que, bueno, diré que d'aquí plora la criatura, perquè no és el mateix, no tenen la mateixa percepció d'amenaça si ens posem al centre o a l'est d'Europa que si ens posem a l'oest d'Europa. El cas de Finlàndia o els països bàltics, que la percepció és nítida del que pot passar, a banda del background que porten cadascun d'aquests països. Més enllà del que acabi passant o no, però quan t'has passat els últims 100 anys ocupat o en guerra amb el teu veí, parlo dels casos dels països bàltics i de Finlàndia, o fins i tot si no hi has estat en guerra, com és el cas de Suècia, però perceps la potencial amenaça, és evident que tiraràs cap a un model més ampli, independentment d'aquest acabi sent professional, de conscripció, etc. En el cas de l'Europa occidental, clar, la percepció és més laxa. De tant en tant passen coses com el del Bataclan i hosti, d'on ha sortit això? I és més difícil d'explicar que combatre estat islàmic a Síria, a l'Iraq o al Qaeda del Mareb islàmic, al Sahel, és imprescindible. Malgrat no hi hagi una percepció d'amenaça directa territorial, Al-Qaeda no entrarà com una divisió Panzer per l'Ebre, no. Tanmateix, hem vist com els casos de Síria i l'Iraq es convertien, passaven de ser una insurgència a passar a ser un actor quasi estatal. I, de fet, la intervenció francesa a Mali s'ha de valorar no tant pels resultats numèrics, sinó pel que va impedir. Si s'hagués retrasat més, haguéssim pogut veure alguna cosa similar al que hem vist a Síria i l'Iraq allà mateix. En aquest aspecte, cap a quina tendència anem? Crec que també per una política curtterminista, com acostuma a ser la majoria dels governs, es mirarà de no ampliar. Tanmateix, ningú té una bola de vidre. Un dels exemples que posàvem al llibre és el dels anys 20. Als anys 20, l'exèrcit alemany estava limitat a 100.000 efectius, amb 4.000 oficials com a màxims, sense tancs, ni aviació, ni marina. En 20 anys tornava a ser la força més poderosa d'Europa. Les coses poden canviar molt ràpidament, com ja ho ha apuntat prèviament el Coronel, i en conseqüència tenir una assegurança mai està de més. I més enllà del model que tris, està disposat a tenir un grau de flexibilitat. Doncs, bueno, podem parlar-ne més endavant. Amb els següents seminaris posarem el contraexemple o l'exemple amics com l'exemple danès, que tenim els ponents aquí. Però, bueno, no sé si t'he respost o...
Una pregunta. Per el tema de la força aquesta voluntària, com es fa per mantenir una estructura on hi hagi prou base? Perquè si s'espera que tu ja estiguis durant un temps, imagino que no voldràs quedar-te sempre baix, també voldràs escalar. Com es fa?
Com, l'estructura voluntària et refereixes en el sentit de voluntaris de professionals o de
Professional. Va, vull dir, en el professional com fas per mantenir una estructura piramidal? Que no acabi tot pujant a...
Sí, aquest és un problema, us l'explicaré millor que un minut, però és cert que a la majoria d'exèrcits que quan es van transformar en una força professional no hi havia la mateixa velocitat d'ascens. I especialment el personal més jove, quan encara tenien la perspectiva de en tinc 25, 30, encara tinc més de mitja vida per davant, si no veu una perspectiva de creixement, doncs, molts acaben marxant. Pot redundar en que hi hagi una força macrocefàlica, com és el cas de l'estat espanyol, però jo no l'agafaria com a model. Tanmateix, aquest és un problema en el que s'ha de tractar i, a més, no hem de descartar també l'element de la selecció de que sigui gent que ja sigui purament de forma vocacional, perquè si és competir amb el sector privat, sempre guanyarà el sector privat. Sempre, sense anar més lluny, un cas concret, el cas dels submarins de míssils balístics del Regne Unit. Per més bé que li paguin a un enginyer nuclear, sempre li pagaran molt millor a terra. I les condicions no són les mateixes. I ara un dels problemes principals que té la dissuasió nuclear del Regne Unit és que no troben gent. I aquest és un problema que hi és. I segueix aquí, em sembla que...
Sí, és que li he traduït la pregunta.
Sí.
Sobre aquest tema jo amb ell ja n'havia parlat.
Maybe what a comment I would add to that is that if there are two streams in the army, there's the soldiers and then there's the commissioned officers. Now, if you join up as a soldier, you can go up to a higher NCO rank, up to Sergeant Major, which is a high rank in our army. And in most cases, a lot of the soldiers, they're not going to stay in the army. They don't plan to stay in it beyond maybe 21 years. And they will leave at that stage and go into the civilian sector. Now, until recently, they did earn a pension at that level. Now it's moved up a little bit more. So it's not quite as attractive as it used to be. But at the same time, that's one. The officer side, however, you want officers to stay. And you make it attractive for them as best as possible to stay, because there's too much time and investment in them. So the officer promotion system, then, you have to, then it depends on the person's ability. Not everybody is going to be a good commandant or colonel or general. There are steps you have to take. You have to have a certain ability to do this. So everyone should know their own level of ability. And I know a lot of people who choose to leave early, say around about 40, 45, and then go into the other sector. Those that stay on tend to do rise in rank all right. It's not a simple question. It's not a question that everyone wants to be on top, because it's not like that. Most of the soldiers I knew never wanted to be officers. They don't want to be officers. And, yet soldiers can become officers. There's a certain streaming always allowed for those who come in as soldiers and they get in as cadets and then go on up, or get commissioned directly with certain professional qualifications. So there's flexibility in the system.
És que en el cas aquest, en el cas d'Irlanda, o sigui, hi ha gent que sí, que es jubila amb el rang de soldat ras. O sigui, tota la seva vida laboral la passen allà. I, de fet, aquesta gent, vull dir, és així perquè el propi exèrcit pretén a retenir-los. No, I mean, the example of the guys that retire being a private, as you told me, the example of truck drivers or
yeah, there is there are a certain amount of soldiers who do not want to have even NCO responsibilities. They don't want to be corporals and sergeants, because they have to, at every level you have responsibility. So there are soldiers who are quite happy. Army cooks, very, very good cooks, you'd be surprised. Drivers, driving big truck and so on like that, they don't want the sergeant's job. There's probably allowances going with these jobs that they have more money anyway than the NCOs have. Certainly as a cook they get extra money for technical pay, and truck drivers and so on as well too, particularly the heavy stuff. So there is a certain amount. It's not that there's great money involved in it. But for those who want it, it's there. Now, in other armies, some armies say, like the British Army, if you do not make corporal in 5 years, you're gone. You don't get your extended. Now, we're not there at that. We tried it for a while, it didn't work, because the point is that if you take a truck driver, you know, do you want a 20-year-old truck driver or a 35-year-old truck driver? You see what I mean? He's still only a private. You want the 35-year-old guy because he's got the experience, or woman for that matter. She has the experience that's there, it builds up. Same with cooks. Cooks keep getting better the longer they're in. Musicians, army musicians, the same thing too. So it is, but it is whether the person likes the service and is happy. I mean, the army is not a place for people who don't like it. And that's why I'm against conscription and all that kind of thing. And in our case, I mean, I'm saying we are very lucky that we've never had conscription in Ireland. The British tried it on us in 1918, and it was actually one of the reasons why the independence movement took off again, because of conscription. Was one of the big causes at the time.
I una altra cosa paradigmàtica dels irlandesos és que aquí ja no passa, però abans sí, els militars no viuen al quarter, o sigui, ells viuen a casa seva, m'agafen, els lleven al matí, se'n van a les 9 a fitxar, diguéssim, al quarter, fan la seva feina, les seves hores, les que toquin, i en acabat es canvien, se'n van a casa seva i tenen una vida, diguéssim, civil i familiar i social perfectament normal i compatible amb la de qualsevol altre ciutadà, no? Que és una mica lligant el que deia en Pol, de que o sigui, si ets capaç de combinar en un model professional el fet de que són professionals però a part, diguéssim, tenen la seva vida privada completament a part i fora d'aquest món, i llavors se'n van a treballar, es posen de verd i fan la seva feina i han acabat plegant i marxen, i tenen la seva família fora, el seu cercle de relacions, amics que no són militars. Diguéssim, és un model professional però que és més compatible, diguéssim, amb una societat democràtica i tal i qual. Si tens els militars professionals tancats en quarters, només es relacionen amb militars, es casen amb filles de militars i d'allò, o sigui, el que acabes fent és una casta de guerrers completament apartada de la societat a la que suposadament haurien de servir i es genera aquesta incomprensió mútua que al final sol desembocar amb colpisme, que és l'exemple desgraciat d'aquest país.
I enllaçant amb això de la desvinculació, també hi sumaria, i també lligat amb l'educació, de fet n'hi ha exemples, poder combinar la formació tècnica en centres civils és un element que també ajuda a la retenció de personal, de seguir enllaçant contractes. Perquè si tu d'allà en surts, ho invento, amb una FP d'electrònica, un grau superior o una carrera, quan tornes al món civil no t'has quedat endarrere. No és allò que has passat els teus 5 anys de servei professional de contracte i veus que la resta de col·legues teus ja tenen la carrera i estan, m'ho invento, a la IBM, a l'Hospital Clínic, on sigui. Dic, per posar algun exemple. Per tant, pots anar retenint personal en aquest aspecte, que saben que no es quedaran enrere, i alhora, si van en centres civils, veure gent que et ve d'uniforme, entre cometes, m'ho invento, algú que faci sensors telèmetres làser, que vagi a la UPF de Castelldefels, que hi ha les ciències fotòniques, i estigui treballant allà. Hòstia, resulta que un dels companys de classe és un militar. Doncs passarà el mateix, no generaran aquestes bombolles de món civil, món militar. I alhora hi haurà un element de reenganxe al sector privat, a la vida civil. Déu-n'hi-do, quin tom he fet.
Sí, disculpeu, ho faré en anglès per estalviar la traducció. Well, thank you for coming here and sharing your view with us. But my question is, it's not only because to me, geopolitics are changing. The power of Russia is growing. There is some concern in the borders. But not only, my concern is not only about that. I would like to know your view on let's say, what Catalonia, the defense model should be. And not only about what is happening at geopolitical level, that we see the authoritarianism is growing, not only outside the European Union, but inside the European Union. But we have been 300 years between two powerful nations. So if we gain independence, how we are going to maintain this independence from the defense perspective in a European Union that we don't know where it's going, in geopolitics that are changing? Because I think what I'm hearing is in the suppose that anything will change, that there will be this stability, but I'm not sure this will be the scenario. So do you have an opinion or a view on how the defense model of Catalonia should be if we gain independence in the next years, considering where Spain is going in terms of division of power and other issues? I was going to finish with the sentence. I haven't read the book. But the fact is we are occupied by another country. So if we gain independence, Russia, China, everything is very good, all that. But my main concern is how we're going to maintain this. And do you think that professional forces will be enough, or we have to go one step behind? I'm not talking mainly about Spain, also France.
Yeah, I give you an approach to it. If you can get the chapter that I wrote in that book, it does actually, it does really help. I think you can get it online anyway. You don't have to buy the book.
Your chapter?
Yes, yeah.
Sí,
You can get it off the website, yeah. In Catalan.
Sí.
Yeah, but anyway, to answer your question for the audience here, because it's a very good question. Spain, and I'm including Catalonia, everyone pays about 1.3% of GDP on defence. You're paying it now. You're paying for your own defence. The Spanish Army, Navy and Air Force are providing that service for you, right? They're there. If there's an invader comes, it's their job. All right. Now, what I'm saying is this, that when the transfer comes, you don't necessarily have to spend more. In fact, you probably could get away with spending somewhat less. But the reason is that Spain, because it's a larger country, it projects itself and it plays a certain role, and the military play a role in international peacekeeping, probably a bigger role than what Catalonia would be expected to do. In the case of so from the point of view is you're already spending the money. You're paying for this. So it's not a question that you want to have to suddenly turn around and start buying and paying for something that you haven't been doing before. At what level should it be at? This is what we call the deterrent factor and the threat. And the easiest way to explain this is that when you left your homes tonight, you took some measures to secure your house. You locked it. And you parked your car and you locked your car, right? You might have an alarm system in, or you might have a dog inside or whatever. But you took some measures to do that. You took the same measures as those that were around you. I mean, you take a street anywhere, and one house, people say habitually, don't lock their doors, don't lock their windows, and everyone else does. What house is going to be burgled? It's going to be the one which makes no preparation. So you've got to have a preparation more or less the same as everybody else. But that doesn't mean to say that somebody could come and still break into your house if they're determined to do it. They can smash in the windows and go in and steal your jewels or whatever you have. But it is the question of you need a deterrent. So how high should that deterrent be? And the easy answer to that is similar to what the other countries around you are spending, because then you blend in, you have a certain approach on it. But I go into that in detail. In the case of Catalonia, I think I recommended, I have the figures now, I can't remember, 25,000 regular soldiers, something like that, between Army, Navy and Air Force, regular personnel, and reserves. But I just took that as an example, indicative example. In other words, not written in stone, but to give you an idea of what you're talking about, that you certainly need a certain amount of, for instance, naval power, a certain amount of air power, and a certain amount of land forces. And so you can work it out from that there about it. But the whole idea is that it is a deterrent, that it is sufficient to make it too costly for an enemy to come in. You have no enemies now, but in 100 years' time, Because you do this not for now. I mean, if you were looking for independence, you're not looking for independence for 20 or 30 years. You want it to be an ongoing situation. And therefore, you have to think down the line. You have to think forward 100 years. And to understand where we are now, you've got to think back 100 years. And then you get an idea of what way it goes, you know?
Ja.
No, sí, comentant això, el seu capítol del llibre, una versió revisada, la tenim publicada a la web, en anglès i en català. Però compreu-vos el llibre, està molt bé.
Sí.
No ens donen res, eh? No ens han donat ni llibres, eh? No ens han donat res.
If you put in my name and you put in El Nacional, there's a good article there. My name, you know my name, I think it's there written somewhere. I'll leave you my card anyway, if you want it. Just put my name in and El Nacional. You could Google it, and there you'll get, you can pass that back to the man there with the white shirt, like myself. If you look in under El Nacional, that article in El Nacional is actually it's easy to read. This is more technical. This is much more technical and detailed. But that article is for the average person in Catalonia to read. That's why it was written like that. I had a friend of mine translate it into Catalan too, so it's good. The language is good anyway. I didn't do that myself.
I have two questions. When you say that you are not in favor of conscription, I can understand why you don't want it, because some people, if you train them to be military and they don't want to be military, you have a bunch of people in the army, let's say, that they don't really want to be there. But I'm thinking of the example of Switzerland, that they all have a military service, and it has been the longest country, if I can recall, that have never been invaded whatsoever. So to me, it seems that a good conscription model, it's a good deterrent for anyone else to leave that piece of land alone.
Yeah, the Swiss, you see, the Swiss are different from many other countries in several respects. The one thing about them is they have this tradition, they kept it up, and it has worked for them. And they are prepared to do this. If you have a referendum in the morning in Switzerland, and they love referendums in Switzerland, they have referendums in Switzerland every second day about issues. But they prefer always to, they've always wanted it this way. So it's their tradition. It's not in most of the tradition of the other countries. The experience of war itself is enough to put people off military service. It's a terrible thing. I've been to war. I've seen it, and I can tell you it is pretty awful, what you can see and what you come across. And so it's not for, if you're not able to take it, then you don't want to be forced to go into these places yourself. But then again, your country needs you. There are times when the issue, you have to ask yourself the question, if your neighbour is being attacked next door, what are you going to do? Are you going to go in and help him? Are you going to use physical violence to help your neighbour if he's physically being attacked? You see, that's the basic question. And if the answer to that is yes, then you can see how, being a soldier fits into society. If the answer is no, well, fair enough. There are conscientious objectors who won't even defend their own children if they're attacked because they don't want to use violence. I'm just saying they're there. There are so many different examples of it. But I personally, as far as the military concerned, the Western countries nowadays, we don't need to have conscription. I don't know what's happened in Sweden. The Swedes have suddenly opted to go back. There should be enough Swedish men and women who are prepared to defend their country without having to conscript them. It's a good country. It has so much to go for it. So there's something missing there. Maybe it's a sense of service. Maybe it's patriotism. Maybe it's something in the education system. And throwing these ideas out, I don't know the answer, but it is a very profound question. But I certainly know one thing as an army officer: I would not like to have had conscript soldiers. Now the Swiss are different. The Swiss don't come in peacekeeping missions, by the way, so they're different. And I have met Swiss army officers on courses abroad. terrific professional guys, the best you could come across. But if they accept if it works for them, it works for them. I don't think it would work for Ireland. And you're going to have a Swiss model anyway,
Yeah.
an analysis
The next
on
one,
that,
yeah.